What if I told you that one of the most beautiful love stories in history isn't just about romance, but about loyalty, faith, and finding your place in a foreign land? Today, we're diving into the incredible biblical story of Ruth, a tale from ancient scripture that's captivated hearts for thousands of years and continues to inspire people across cultures and faiths. Our biblical story begins in the small town of Bethlehem during a time when famine struck the land. Picture this: crops failing, families struggling to survive, and difficult decisions having to be made. A man named Elimelech lived there with his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. When the famine became unbearable, Elimelech made a tough choice. He packed up his family and moved them to Moab, a neighboring country where food was more plentiful. For an Israelite family, this wasn't just moving to a different neighborhood. The Moabites worshipped different gods and had different customs. It was like moving to an entirely different world. But sometimes, survival requires stepping into the unknown. Life in Moab started well enough. The two sons grew up and married local women. Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. These weren't just business arrangements. These were real marriages built on love and companionship. For about 10 years, this blended family made it work. But then tragedy struck in the cruelest way possible. First, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi widowed in a foreign land. Then, in a devastating blow, both of her sons died as well. Imagine Naomi's situation. She's now a widow in her 60s, living in a country that isn't her home, with no male relatives to provide for her. In that culture and time, this was essentially a death sentence. Women had very few rights or means of supporting themselves, but she wasn't completely alone. She had her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, who had also become widows. These three women, bound together by grief and loss, now had to figure out how to survive. When Naomi heard that the famine had ended back in Bethlehem, she made a decision. She would return home. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where we see the true character of these women. As they started the journey back to Bethlehem, Naomi stopped and turned to Ruth and Orpah. What she said next reveals both her love for them and her understanding of the harsh reality they faced. "Go back," she told them. "Return to your mother's homes. You're young. You can still remarry and have families of your own. But I'm old, and I have nothing to offer you in Bethlehem." This was both practical advice and an act of love. In Moab, Ruth and Orpah had a chance at new lives. In Bethlehem, they would be foreign widows with no prospects. Orpah, after much tears and embracing, decided to return to her family. It was the sensible choice, and no one could blame her for it. But Ruth made a decision that would echo through history. What Ruth said next has become one of the most quoted passages in literature, spoken at countless weddings and moments of commitment. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Think about what Ruth was choosing. She was leaving everything familiar: her homeland, her gods, her culture, her chance at a new marriage and family. She was choosing to follow an elderly woman into poverty and uncertainty. But Ruth saw something in Naomi, something in her faith and her people, that was worth more than security. This wasn't just loyalty, it was a leap of faith into the unknown. So the two women arrived in Bethlehem, one returning home after years away, the other entering a completely foreign world. The townspeople barely recognized Naomi, and their arrival caused quite a stir. But excitement doesn't pay bills or fill empty stomachs. These two widows needed to survive, and quickly. Ruth took the initiative. She learned about a Jewish custom that allowed the poor to glean, to gather leftover grain from the edges of fields after the harvest. It was back-breaking work, potentially dangerous for a young foreign woman working alone, but it was legal, and it could keep them from starving. Ruth set out early each morning to work in the fields. She was diligent, respectful, and hard-working. The other workers noticed her, and word began to spread about this foreign woman who was caring for her mother-in-law. One day, Ruth happened to find herself gleaning in a field that belonged to a man named Boaz, and "happened" might be too casual a word. In this story, there seemed to be very few coincidences. Boaz was wealthy, respected, and Here's the important part. He was related to Naomi's late husband. When he saw Ruth working in his field, he asked his workers about her. What he heard impressed him. This was the young woman who had left everything to care for her mother-in-law. Boaz didn't just admire Ruth from afar. He acted. He told his workers to protect her, to let her drink from their water jars, and even to purposely drop extra grain for her to find. When Ruth asked why he was being so kind to a foreigner, Boaz replied that he had heard about her loyalty to Naomi and her willingness to trust in the God of Israel. But there was something else in his eyes when he looked at Ruth, something that went beyond mere kindness to a stranger. Naomi wasn't blind to what was happening. She saw how Boaz treated Ruth, and she began to form a plan. In their culture, there was a tradition called kinsman redeemer. A close relative could marry a widow to preserve the family line and property. Boaz was eligible, but he wasn't the closest relative. Still, Naomi saw an opportunity for Ruth to have the security and love she deserved. The plan Naomi proposed was bold and risky. During the harvest celebration, Ruth would go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be sleeping, uncover his feet, and lie down there. It sounds scandalous to our modern ears, but it was actually a symbolic way of asking for his protection and proposing marriage. Ruth trusted Naomi completely. After all, if you're going to take advice about finding love in a foreign country, who better to listen to than someone who's been watching out for you all along? That night, Ruth did exactly as Naomi instructed. She waited until Boaz was asleep, then quietly uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, Boaz woke up, startled to find someone there. "Who are you?" he asked in the darkness. "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Ruth was essentially proposing to Boaz, asking him to marry her and take on the responsibility of caring for her and Naomi. It took courage. What if he said no? What if he was offended? But Boaz's response revealed his character. He was honored by her request, not offended. He called her a woman of noble character and said he would be happy to marry her. However, there was one complication. There was another relative who had the first right of refusal. The next morning, Boaz went to the town gate, essentially the ancient equivalent of a courthouse, to settle the matter legally. He called together 10 elders as witnesses and confronted the closer relative. Here's where it gets interesting. Boaz presented the situation strategically. First, he mentioned that Naomi was selling a piece of property that had belonged to her husband. The relative was interested. Property was valuable. But then Boaz added the kicker. If you buy the property, you also have to marry Ruth to preserve the family line. Suddenly, the relative wasn't so interested. Taking on a young foreign wife and the responsibility for her children would complicate his own family inheritance. "I cannot redeem it," the man said, "because I might endanger my own estate." And with that, he transferred his right to Boaz. The deal was sealed with the ancient equivalent of a signature. The man took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz in front of all the witnesses. Boaz and Ruth were married, and their love story became the stuff of legend. But this wasn't just a personal happy ending. It had far-reaching consequences. Ruth, the foreign woman who had left everything behind, gave birth to a son named Obed. The women of the town celebrated with Naomi, saying, "This child will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." And here's where the story connects to something much bigger. Obed grew up and had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David. Yes, that David, who became the greatest king in Israel's history. Which means Ruth, the Moabite woman who chose loyalty over security, became the great-grandmother of King David and, according to Christian tradition, an ancestor of Jesus Christ. The story of Ruth teaches us that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the most difficult choices. Ruth chose love over security, loyalty over comfort, and faith over familiarity. She stepped into the unknown and found not just survival, but purpose, love, and a place in history. It's a story about how kindness creates more kindness. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi led to Boaz's kindness to Ruth, which led to a love that changed the course of history. And it's a reminder that our backgrounds don't determine our futures. Ruth was a foreigner, a widow, essentially a refugee. But her character, her choices, and her faith opened doors she never could have imagined. In a world that often seems divided by differences, Ruth's story shows us the beauty that can emerge when we choose to see beyond cultural boundaries and embrace what connects us as human beings. What choices are you facing that might seem scary, but could lead to something beautiful? Sometimes, like Ruth, we have to be willing to step into the unknown to discover who we're meant to become. If this biblical story resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more timeless stories that still speak to our hearts today. What other biblical stories would you like to hear? Let me know in the comments below.